Whitney Houston, baby, let's really talk about it, because this whole situation between Whitney Houston and Wendy Williams was never just some messy radio drama like people made it seem at the time. No, it was way deeper, and honestly, looking back now, it hits different. So picture this: Whitney Houston is sitting there, already irritated, already defensive, because Wendy Williams has been talking about her nonstop. And not just like gossip either. We're talking about very personal stuff. Her marriage, her money, her habits, her family. Wendy was digging into everything like she had a backstage pass to Whitney Houston's life. And Whitney, she wasn't having it. Whitney straight up snapped, like not even holding back. She's like, why are you so obsessed with me? And you could hear it in her voice, that frustration, that exhaustion. Whitney Houston kept repeating how Wendy Williams didn't know her, never lived with her, never saw what she actually went through, but still felt comfortable speaking like she did. And honestly, I get why Whitney felt that way. Imagine dealing with that level of scrutiny every single day. But at the same time, Wendy Williams wasn't just being messy for fun. That's the part people are starting to rethink now. Because yes, Wendy was harsh. Yes, she crossed lines, but there were moments where it didn't feel like she was just dragging Whitney Houston. It felt like she was warning her. You remember when Whitney Houston shut down those crack rumors? She said it herself: crack is cheap. I make too much money for that. That line became iconic, but also kind of sad in hindsight. Because while Whitney Houston denied certain things, she also admitted later that she had struggled with substances. And Wendy Williams, who had her own past with addiction, recognized that version of Whitney Houston immediately. She even said she saw herself in Whitney. That's why Wendy Williams kept pushing. She wasn't gentle about it, not at all, but she kept saying Whitney Houston needed real help, not just surface level fixes. Wendy literally said outpatient rehab wasn't enough. She didn't believe Whitney Houston was fully sober during some of those public appearances. And again, harsh delivery, but there was something real behind it. Now here's where it starts getting even more interesting. Wendy Williams wasn't just talking about Whitney Houston's addiction like it was a personal issue. She started tying it to the industry, and that's when people started looking at her sideways. Wendy basically hinted that once someone like Whitney Houston becomes a liability, the industry doesn't protect them anymore. In fact, it does the opposite. It uses their struggles against them. And she kept repeating this idea that Whitney Houston needed to get herself together before it was too late, not just for her health, but because of what the industry might do. At the time, people brushed it off like, okay, Wendy, you're doing too much. But now people are like, wait, because Whitney Houston did pass away under tragic circumstances. Official reports said it was accidental drowning with substances involved. That's what's documented. But you know how the internet works. Once something doesn't fully sit right with people, the theories start coming in fast. And suddenly, people started revisiting everything Wendy Williams said. Some started claiming Whitney Houston had discovered things behind the scenes that she wasn't supposed to. Others started talking about contracts, money issues, people allegedly taking advantage of her financially. And then you have those more extreme rumors, industry secrets, powerful figures, all that stuff people love to speculate about. Now listen, none of that is confirmed. A lot of it is speculation, and it gets wild real quick. But what's interesting is how Wendy Williams's words started sounding different after Whitney Houston passed. What once sounded like gossip started sounding like concern. And let's not forget, Wendy herself admitted she wasn't perfect. She openly talked about her own struggles with substances. She wasn't speaking from a place of being above Whitney Houston. If anything, she was speaking like someone who recognized the pattern and didn't want to see the same ending. But the way she delivered it, that's what made it messy. Because instead of it sounding like support, it sounded like constant public criticism. And Whitney Houston, already dealing with pressure from everywhere, felt attacked. There was this one moment where Whitney basically told Wendy Williams to watch what she says, like really check herself. You could feel that tension through the screen. It wasn't playful, it was real. And honestly, both of them were right in their own way. Whitney Houston deserved respect and privacy. No one should be dissecting your life like that every day. But Wendy Williams also wasn't completely wrong about the bigger picture, about how the industry treats people once they start struggling. And now, years later, people are connecting dots that may or may not even be connected. They're looking at Whitney Houston's life, her challenges, her relationships, and asking questions that didn't feel as loud back then. Even the timing of certain events, like parties still happening, industry figures moving like nothing happened, people noticed that, and it made them uncomfortable. So when you go back and watch that old interview of Whitney Houston going off on Wendy Williams, it doesn't feel like just a celebrity clapback anymore. It feels like two women who understood more than they were saying out loud, just expressing it in completely different ways. And that's why this whole story still gets people talking, because it's not just about gossip. It's about what happens behind the scenes when fame, pressure, addiction, and power all collide. Whitney Houston's story didn't just end with that tension on radio, and that's the part that keeps pulling people back into this conversation. Because once Whitney Houston passed, everything Wendy Williams had been saying started getting replayed in people's minds, like, wait, what exactly did she mean back then? Now, suddenly, people weren't just looking at Whitney Houston as a struggling artist. They started looking at the environment around her, the people, the power structure, and baby, that's where things start getting messy. So there were whispers going around that Whitney Houston wasn't just dealing with addiction. That was already public. But behind that, people started saying she was dealing with financial issues too, contracts, money being mishandled, people around her taking more than they should. And apparently, Whitney Houston had started noticing things. Now, again, nothing here is officially confirmed, but you know how these stories move in circles? Some were saying Whitney Houston was planning to take legal action against certain people in her circle. And if that's even remotely true, that changes everything, because now you're not just dealing with a vulnerable artist, you're dealing with someone who's about to disrupt a system. And Wendy Williams, she had hinted at this whole liability thing way before. She kept saying that once someone becomes hard to insure, hard to work with, or unpredictable, the industry doesn't know what to do with them anymore. And when there's money on the line, people start making cold decisions. Now let's talk about that Beverly Hilton situation for a second, because this is where things really start raising eyebrows for people. Whitney Houston passes away in the hotel, and at the same time, there's a major pre-Grammy party happening in that same building, hosted by Clive Davis. And people were like, hold on, you're telling me Whitney Houston, someone so closely connected to him, passes away in the same place, and the party still goes on? Now, to be fair, some people say the decision had already been made, logistics were in place, and it wasn't as simple as shutting everything down instantly. But emotionally, it didn't sit right with a lot of people. It felt cold, it felt detached. Even Wendy Williams questioned that energy. Like, how do you celebrate in the same building where someone you worked with, someone you influenced, is lying lifeless upstairs? That moment alone added fuel to everything else people were already suspecting. Then you've got another layer coming in, the private investigator claims. A man named Paul Hubel started saying Whitney Houston's death wasn't as simple as it looked. He claimed there were signs of struggle, that two men were seen entering her suite, that it could have been tied to a massive unpaid debt. Now listen, this is where you have to be careful, because this kind of stuff can spiral into full conspiracy mode real fast. But the reason people didn't immediately dismiss it is because small details started getting picked apart, like the mention of minor injuries, the abrasions, the condition of the room. People started asking, was there more to this than what we were told? Officially, the cause of death was accidental drowning with contributing factors. That's the record. But public curiosity, that's a whole different beast. And then you have Bobby Brown making comments over time that didn't exactly calm people down either. He hinted at things not being as straightforward as they seemed. Nothing direct, nothing fully detailed, but enough to keep people questioning. Even Ray J gets pulled into the conversation because he was reportedly one of the last people to see Whitney Houston alive. And again, nothing confirmed, but when you start stacking all these names and moments together, people start building their own narratives. And through all of this, Wendy Williams' role starts looking different, because now it doesn't feel like she was just gossiping about Whitney Houston for attention. It feels like she was watching something unfold in real time and didn't know how to communicate it properly. She kept saying Whitney Houston needed to get clean, needed to protect herself, needed to be careful. And people thought she was being cruel, but now some are wondering if she was actually scared for Whitney Houston. And here's another twist. Wendy Williams herself ended up in a situation where people started questioning her freedom, her voice, her ability to speak openly. That whole guardianship situation had people raising eyebrows too, because now the narrative becomes, was Wendy Williams silenced? Or is that just another layer people are adding because the story already feels mysterious? And that's the thing with situations like this. Once doubt enters the conversation, it spreads everywhere. Every action, every decision, every relationship gets reanalyzed. Whitney Houston's legacy becomes more than just her music. It becomes this complex story of fame, pressure, control, and what really happens behind the scenes when someone reaches that level. And Wendy Williams, she goes from being labeled as messy and disrespectful to someone people are now re-examining, like, did she actually see something we didn't? Because when she talked about Whitney Houston back then, it wasn't soft, it wasn't kind, but it was persistent. And sometimes persistence comes from knowing something deeper, or at least feeling like you do. So now when people revisit those interviews, those clips, those moments where Whitney Houston checked Wendy Williams publicly, it feels heavier. It feels like two sides of a story that never fully got told. And honestly, the more you look at it, the more it feels like we only saw the surface of what was really going on around Whitney Houston. Whitney Houston's name still carries so much weight, and that's exactly why this conversation refuses to die down. Because the more people revisit everything, the interviews, the warnings, the rumors, the more it starts to feel like we only ever got pieces of the full story. So now fast forward, and people are looking at Wendy Williams in a completely different light. Back then, she was labeled messy, loud, invasive. And yes, she definitely crossed lines. Nobody is denying that. But now people are asking, was Wendy Williams just being reckless? Or was she reacting to something she genuinely believed was bigger than Whitney Houston's personal struggles? Because Wendy didn't just talk about addiction. She kept circling back to control, power, and how the industry treats people once they stop being profitable in the clean, polished way executives prefer. And that's a real conversation, whether people want to admit it or not. Whitney Houston was one of the biggest stars in the world. Her voice, her image, her presence, everything about her was an investment. And when you're that valuable, there are layers of people around you, managers, executives, business partners, all tied to your success. So when things start slipping, it doesn't just affect you, it affects everyone attached to you financially. Now, does that mean something sinister happened? That's where things get tricky. Because a lot of what's floating around is speculation. Stories about debts, stories about people entering her room, stories about contracts and money. Some of it sounds believable on the surface, especially when you look at how chaotic her final years seemed, but none of it has been officially proven beyond the documented reports. What is real, though, is that Whitney Houston struggled. That part is not up for debate. And when someone is struggling publicly like that, it becomes very easy for the narrative to get controlled by others. Headlines get written, images get pushed, and suddenly the world only sees one version of you. And that's something Wendy Williams tapped into, even if she did it in the harshest way possible. She kept saying Whitney Houston was being turned into a headline instead of being helped like a human being. And whether you liked Wendy or not, that point hits. But then you also have to look at how Wendy delivered everything, because there's a difference between warning someone and exposing them. And Wendy often blurred that line. She didn't just say Whitney needs help. She broke it down on air piece by piece in a way that made it entertainment for listeners. That's why Whitney Houston reacted the way she did. That anger, that defensiveness, that you don't know me energy, it wasn't just about Wendy. It was about everyone who felt entitled to comment on her life without understanding what she was actually dealing with behind closed doors. And honestly, both sides reflect something real. Whitney Houston represents what it feels like to be under constant pressure and judgment. Wendy Williams represents how the media operates when it senses vulnerability, it pushes, it questions, it speculates, sometimes too far. Now, when people bring in theories about powerful figures, secret deals, or hidden motives, it's easy to get pulled into that because it makes the story feel bigger, almost cinematic. But sometimes the truth is less dramatic and more uncomfortable. Sometimes it's about a person dealing with real struggles in an environment that doesn't know how to protect them properly. That doesn't mean people around Whitney Houston were perfect. It doesn't mean every decision made around her was right. There were definitely moments that made people question things, like the timing of events, the way certain situations were handled, the lack of sensitivity in some public responses. But jumping straight to extreme conclusions without solid proof, that's where things can get misleading. And that's something people forget when these stories get retold again and again. What makes Whitney Houston's story powerful isn't just the mystery people try to build around it. It's the reality of what she gave to the world and what she went through at the same time. The voice was unmatched. The impact was undeniable. But behind all of that, she was still dealing with very human battles. And Wendy Williams, she ends up being this complicated figure in the story. Not a villain, not a hero, just someone who saw things from her own perspective and spoke on them in a way that got attention, for better or worse. So when people ask, did Whitney Houston know too much or was there something deeper going on? The honest answer is we don't fully know. What we do know is that Whitney Houston deserved better in a lot of ways. Better support, better understanding, better protection from being reduced to headlines. And that old moment where Whitney Houston checked Wendy Williams, it's still one of the most telling clips. Because in that moment, you saw a woman standing up for herself, demanding respect, even when the whole world was watching and judging. That's the part people shouldn't forget. Not just the rumors, not just the theories, but Whitney Houston as a person trying to hold on to her dignity in a space that often didn't give her much room to breathe. And maybe that's why this story still lingers. Not because of what we don't know, but because of what we saw happen right in front of us.